College in Cambridge, and to those of you online, thank you for joining us. Welcome to our discussion on Let's Talk Speaking. So my name's Caroline Thiriot, and I'm a publisher at Cambridge University Press, and I'll be facilitating the discussion this evening. I'm thrilled to be joined by 5 ELT experts. We have Ben Goldstein, Kerry Jones, Catherine O'Dell, Leslie Hendra and Mark Ibbotson. Welcome. Between them they have a multitude of skills in a multitude of areas of ELT authoring, materials writing, as teachers, as teacher trainers, and we worked out earlier that between them they speak about 9 languages. One of them has a very special skill, and that is sign language for crane drivers, but I'll leave you to work out which one that is later. So thank you very much for joining us. A little round of applause, maybe? Okay. Before we start, I just thought it would be good to give you a little bit of context as to where this discussion idea came from. So, bear with me a minute. Okay, so earlier this year, Cambridge University Press and the University of Nottingham ran a global ELT survey. And we had over 14,000 responses from teachers and learners all around the globe. One of the questions was, what do you find most difficult in English? This was a completely open question, so it means that we didn't have any prompts at all for them to choose from. So they were free to use open text to say what they thought was the most difficult thing about English. And speaking was cited as the most challenging area, as you can see, by quite a long margin. And this, we felt, really tallied with what we were hearing in our market research with teachers and students that we were carrying out at the time. What we were finding was that students were saying that their own measure of progress is through speaking. So regardless of whether or not they're moving up a class, moving up a level in the institution, or getting good grades in tests, for them, if they went out into the world and were faced with a situation in which they needed to speak English and couldn't perform, that's their measure of their own progress in English. Okay. So we followed up with a new survey in October, focusing on teaching speaking, because we wanted to know more about this. So this time, we had 733 responses from teachers, just teachers this time, around the world, and 70% of them echoed what we'd heard in the previous survey. So 70% said that speaking was the most important, so the most important skill to teach is what we were asking here. Now, we knew from our observations and our focus groups that teachers were telling us that it was difficult to get students to engage in speaking practice in the classroom. And so one of the questions we asked was, what do you think prevents some students from participating fully in speaking practice? And the majority said these 2 things, shyness and embarrassment. And in the students' own words, these are some of the things that the students said. So there were some key words that came out. Nervous, awkward, embarrassed. That's how they felt about speaking practice in the class. So from the teacher's perspective, what does this mean? Well, the challenges that the teachers face are things like not being able to give speaking enough time because there's not enough time in the curriculum, getting students to stop feeling embarrassed, so overcoming that, and overcoming self-confidence issues as well. So we felt this was a really interesting area, a topic for discussion. We've got this situation where students are measuring their own progress through how well they can speak in unplanned situations, in real-life situations. Teachers who understand the importance of teaching speaking, but who then struggle to get the students to engage in the classroom with speaking practice due to these sort of issues like shyness and embarrassment and lack of time. Which led us to question, are we failing our students in this area? Is there more we could be doing? Let's talk speaking. So, over to the panel. What do you make of all this? And does it tally with your experiences?
Okay, well, I'm going to kick off with an anecdote, which I think is related to what Caroline was talking about. And I think that when considering these issues, it's very good to put yourself or to remember a moment when you were a student. So I spend a lot of time writing materials, teacher training and teaching, but actually when I was thinking about how I could kick this off, I thought, when was the last time I faced a situation like these descriptions that students have given as a student? And it was, it came when I was going to go to Brazil for work, and I've lived in Spain many years. My Spanish is now pretty good, but I had to go to Brazil for 2 months, and I thought I'd like to do a kind of crash course in Portuguese, and I thought, well, it probably won't be that difficult because I have a good knowledge of a language which is very, very similar. So I started, it was a summer course, crash course, and I had a bit of trouble because of my receptive ability. You know, I understood quite a lot, but I just could not speak. And there was a bit of a mixed ability in that summer course as well. Quite a lot of the speakers, quite a lot of the learners did have some Portuguese already, so I felt rather intimidated. And I remember once, 2 or 3 weeks now into the course, I remember talking to the teacher outside the classroom, and we've actually found ourselves talking in kind of Portuguese, although in my case it was like a portuñol, half Portuguese, half Espanol. And I remember the teacher saying to me, "But Ben, now you're actually speaking a little bit better now. You're actually constructing sentences in Portuguese, and it's not just portuñol." And I said to her, I remember saying to her, "Yeah, but this is the coffee break. You know, we're outside the classroom. I don't feel this confident when I'm inside the classroom with the other students." And she said, "Oh, that's kind of actually really revealing that you say that. That means you feel in the coffee break here with me now, just the two of us, you feel that this is a more intimate context where you have that confidence." And that was very true. And it struck me as a kind of consequence of that anecdote. I think that one of the things that we should be trying to achieve, is to bring a little bit of the coffee break into the classroom. In other words, speaking, it seems to me, it goes on all the time, and there's a lot of incidental learning when you're speaking and listening in class. You don't have to do a speaking task with a capital T. And I think that's what was going on in that class, was there were this specific, everything was very separated, and there were speaking tasks that we had to do, and that's where I was failing. If the teacher maybe had, I mean, this is my, let's say my conclusions, drawing my conclusions, thinking back to that moment, I was thinking maybe if the teacher had allowed for more chat, more informal conversation, more incidental learning, I would have maybe felt more comfortable about my ability to speak, or felt safer in that learning context. So that's a little way to kind of kick things off. This idea, I think that speaking, speaking goes on all the time, and a lot of incidental learning can take place. A lot of learning from each other, a lot of peer learning can take place, and we don't always have to do tasks, which with the speaking tasks, which are necessarily in the book. So.
I had an experience recently in English as a native English speaker that made me really think about things I had kind of asked students to do in the past that might be difficult. I have a friend who recently started a podcast, and she's interviewing different people about life after cancer. And she hasn't done it yet, but in the near future has asked me to be on the program. And I said yes, and all she told me was she wants to interview me as a friend that helped her go through it. And I'm nervous. I'm dreading it. And I've asked her several times, "Well, what questions are you going to ask me?" And she said, "Well, I'm not going to tell you, because the whole point of my podcast is that it's natural, it's spontaneous. I want real answers. I don't want you to think about it." And I'm absolutely terrified. And I thought, how many times have I as a teacher done that to students? Or how many courses have they had that don't give them any preparation for speaking? So they definitely need that spontaneous speaking and the easy conversations. But if you're asking them to do a presentation or something more formal, I started thinking, how much preparation do they need? And I keep thinking, I could do so much better if Jenna would just give me a hint, tell me 2 questions. And I think, how can we prepare students to speak when they do have to give a more formal presentation or speak where they feel there's a risk of being embarrassed? And how can we help them get to the point where they're not as nervous or scared? And can we give them ways to think or brainstorm before they have to do things like that in the classroom.
What do you think when you ask for the questions in advance, what is it that you're worried about happening if you didn't have those questions?
You know, a couple things. Part of it is it's just so personal, so I don't want to offend her in any, you know, I want to think about how I word things. And I think part of it is being a writer, I think a lot about what I put on paper before I put it on paper. So that idea of just having to talk and that other people are going to hear it. You know, I have no problem in a conversation or talking with friends or colleagues, but this is something that people I don't know are going to hear, and I want to sound good. You know, I want my answers to make
like
sense.
now, like right now.
Exactly.
It's kind of like going public on anything, isn't
Right.
it? And it's kind of, so I think as a speaker of Spanish as my second language, and I was in that situation recently as being like in a parents' meeting, and someone had to volunteer to be the representative for the group. And I've lived in Spain for almost 20 years, but I still felt really, really shy about putting myself forward as being the representative for that group because I was the only non-Spanish first language speaker. And so I just kind of, cowered there for a good couple of minutes before slowly kind of go, well, no one else wants to do it, I'll do it. But it was linguistic. My kind of, the shyness was all to do with, now I have to do all of the communication side of it, and which was silly, but it was the going public.
Unexpected context.
Yeah.
I had a similar experience to that, Kerry, because I live in France, and I'm similar to situation to you. I've lived there for over 20 years, speak the language fluently. And kind of relating this to fear, I'm in a judo club. I do judo and jiu-jitsu. And generally, in a lesson, you do about an hour of techniques and you're actually learning something new. But the last half hour is just combat, it's kind of, and it's pretty kind of a bit scary sometimes, particularly when you're with people, who are better than you. But to kind of put that in perspective, I think the scariest situation I've been in that club was actually at the annual general meeting of the club. And there were about maybe 50 people there. Quite a few people I didn't know who were parents of younger members and so on. And there was one point where I wanted to speak up and make a point. And just before I put my hand up to speak, I shied away from it because I just didn't want to draw attention to myself as a non-native speaker. Nobody would have judged me, but I just felt uncomfortable about it, and the fear factor was there. So paradoxically, scarier speaking than actually doing the judo. Combat.
So the odds were greater, actually. The physical pain was okay, but
the stakes were higher. Yeah.
I've had awkward experiences too because in a certain country that I spoke their language a little bit, but whenever they heard me, they all laughed, and I was very nervous and upset, and I was told that they often laughed because they thought it was cute or they were surprised, which was interesting. So I swore that when I went into a classroom, I would do everything that I could to make my students feel relaxed and happy and never laughed at, because my laugh might have been they thought they were cute, but they might have interpreted it anyway. So I thought about how I can make my classroom a very safe kind of space where they felt completely unjudged, non-criticized. And the first thing was to get them to relax. And I often worked with low-level students. So as soon as they came in, I was chatting with them right away. How are you? Where are you from? Let's go to a map, show the other students, etc. And got them used to the idea, even with very minimal language, of chatting and speaking, so as to sort of normalize the feeling of speaking. But also what I did was a lot of kinesthetic activities, because I know it seems really silly to push around, say, animal pictures with words, but whenever I gave them these cards, it didn't matter whether we were preparing for the theme of the lesson or working with vocabulary, they would throw themselves on the floor and they were talking and they were working out meaning and chatting without even knowing it. They were just right in there speaking. I mean, we'll talk later about formal tasks, but already I was trying to get them speaking and feeling comfortable and not worrying about how they sounded to their peers or in front of me.
And I think when you see that situation happen, when you overcome the fear of speaking, I mean, thinking about from the teaching side, groups that I had, I think the best group that I ever had, that I ever taught, was it was a group from the Chamber of Commerce, and all the people in the group were people like bakers or market traders and builders, and actually on paper you would have thought these are going to be quite difficult learners, because a lot of them had left school at a fairly young age, none of them had been through university education, so theoretically, you would have thought they're going to find it really difficult. But actually, because of their personality types, because they had kind of way above average levels of self-confidence and extroversion, and they were all kind of entrepreneur types, because of that, speaking wasn't a problem from a fear perspective, and so it was just so easy. They just spoke. So it's kind of, although that's an example of personalities, removing the fear factor, when it's not there, the point is that it just really works as a lesson. It's so much easier and so much better for the learners.
So what do you think we can do as educators to sort of practically address these issues around speaking, the shyness, the embarrassment? Because obviously, if you've got a group of really self-confident students, it might actually not be an issue to get them speaking, but very often the class is just obviously a complete mixture of different personality types. So is there anything that we can do, different ways of thinking maybe about speaking tasks that might help overcome these barriers?
I think one thing is to speak often, not have it just be a big presentation that they give, not have it just be a coffee break type activity at the beginning, but spread it throughout the class. So there's always speaking going on, and it becomes normal.
Yeah.
Instead of having it be one big thing they have to fear at the end, or one little thing they do at the beginning, and then they don't have to think about it for the rest of the lesson.
I think we can scaffold those moments for lower level students as well. So if you think about the routine kind of stuff that we do chat about at the beginning of a lesson, sort of, did you do the homework? Or what did you do at the weekend, or whatever kind of throwaway question it is. But working with kind of lower level students to actually take time to prepare them so that they actually have something to say about. And so taking one lesson where you might spend 20 minutes actually building the kind of language that they can use in response to those questions, so that when that comes up in the next lesson, they feel like, okay, no, I'm prepared for this. I know what I can say. And although there might be students in your class who've got no problem whatsoever with that particular moment, and there'll be others who maybe are always shying back, they haven't got the answer to give, and so I think we can even kind of scaffold that for those reticent speakers, so that come on, you can say more than
Yeah, I think scaffolding and as Kerry was saying, scaffolding and feedback that kind of feedback is essential, and I think this notion of getting students to understand that doing it up to a certain, they don't have to do it perfectly, that partial competence, which is kind of concept the Common European Framework introduced. What can you do? Okay, you're not going to be able to do it like I can do it as a native speaker, but feel good about, this teacher's role is a little bit, I want you to feel good about what you can do at this stage, and that is all about the right kind of scaffolding, reconstructing, reformulating, helping the student communicate what, having the sensitivity to feel what the student wants to communicate at that moment, at their point of need. And I mean, there is a great skill in that, but I think that is a very important aspect, the right kind of feedback. And we can, in terms of materials, we can provide another kind of scaffolding as well in the materials that we're writing, in terms of sample answers, in terms of useful language prompts that the students feel that with these, we're not asking you to come up with an incredibly long, fluent answer that you might be able to give in your mother tongue, but just feel okay about doing it up to this point. And I do think that's a very positive
do you think that
way to deal with that.
Do you think students are satisfied with partial competence?
Well, I think the Common European Framework establishes these, speaking interactions, the divide speaking into two. And this is where it's all. That's why it's been on the agenda now for why speaking has become doubly important. They divide it into speaking interaction and spoken interaction, spoken production, and those, whatever you think about those descriptors or those statements. They do establish at different levels different expectations, different standards, different expectations for students at different levels, different competencies. And I think I think using that as a framework can be very useful for students to feel okay about just saying this much.
But I think it's,
sorry Leslie, no, go
I was
ahead.
going to say, I think it's okay to be partially competent, but they want to be competent, don't they? They want to, they are adults often, we're teaching adults, and they feel they've been sent back to childhood. They're so competent in their own language, suddenly they feel like children again. And the most important thing is that we ease that awkward feeling of feeling incompetent, and that whatever they say is all right, but also help them to move ahead. I mean, oftentimes teachers say that a huge part of our job is psychological, setting that wonderful, relaxed atmosphere, very supportive and encouraging, and yet at the same time, there's the practical one, which is devising fascinating and engaging tasks that they can lose themselves in so much that they don't realize they're speaking another language and they don't realize the passage of time. So in that case...
Kind of immersive task.
Immersive task, yeah.
Yeah.
And in that sense, it's really lovely because I have seen classes who were terribly nervous and very disparate groups. I had a young teenager, and a gentleman of 80-some. I had people from different countries, and they were terribly nervous. But in the end, this class was practically all in love with each other. And I don't know what happened, but you have to knit your class first. And after that, set your engaging tasks, because people say without engagement, there will be no immersive tasks. They have to be fully engaged. But I also think without relaxation and a feeling of support, there won't be any engagement or immersion. So it's hugely important to choose topics that they love and stage these lessons really well, and then allow them to, the time. They need not to feel, they shouldn't feel rushed, because oftentimes we're sort of trying to get them to do something in 2 minutes, but if we can give them the luxury of time where they can really relax and engage with that task, I think that's hugely valuable.
And you mentioned the topics as well, Leslie. I mean, that's critical, because even as a native speaker in another situation, having a conversation with people, sometimes when the topic's right, you're bursting to say things. You can't get a word in edgeways because everybody's got something to say. But then on other occasions, it's just nobody's got anything to say, and so that factor between engaging people and not engaging them is multiplied by several factors in a language lesson, because you've got to be highly motivated. You've got to really want to say something in order to tackle that fear of speaking and actually speak.
You have to also feel that you're able to say what you want to say, because it can be incredibly counterproductive. That thing of I've got something I'm burning to say and I do not have the language to say it at all. So I think we have to be careful to balance the challenge of the task that we're setting with the abilities of the students, and that so if you can actually hit that sweet point where the two of them are kind of at that peak, and then that's when they'll be able to push themselves to perform as well as they possibly can, but without having pushed them so far that then suddenly they feel that their language is breaking down, and it's such a delicate balance.
And that's kind of that would be going too far, as you say, Carrie. But at the same time, and I think this relates back to what you said before, Caroline, about expectations. That I think the expectation among learners is that I shouldn't speak until I know that I can say this without making mistakes. That's a common expectation.
This is the partial competence
and
do it as well as you can in that moment.
And I think it needs explanation from the teacher at the beginning, at the beginning of a whole course, to say, look, it doesn't matter if you make mistakes. It's normal that you make mistakes. You're not expected to be completely prepared 100% to never make mistakes when you open your mouth to start speaking. And I think in that regard, language learning is different from other types of learning, where very often you're kind of building up to something and preparing for it, and then when you finally get to the stage that you produce something, you're already quite good. In language learning, it's not like that, and mistakes are inherent to the learning process. But we need to explain that to learners and make them feel comfortable about.
Also, learners expect that the teacher will provide the topics, will provide all the input, and of course, one way to motivate and to engage learners is for them to come up with their own topics. And to be a reactive, responsive teacher, so that you walk in and you do your usual what happened at the weekend, and one of them says, I got married, or something like that. I think it's Scott Thornbury says that wonderful anecdote about he went and observed a class where one of the students said that I got married this weekend, and that's interesting. Turn to page 97. The teacher completely ignores this kind of obviously very very interesting piece of information, and just carries on with their agenda. And I think that kind of responsive teaching, responding to the here and now of the classroom, responding to what has happened in a student's life perhaps, and getting them, not take over the class, but to use that material, to use that input, student as input, and getting students to suggest topics to bring in material themselves is another great way to make those classes more engaging.
Kind of going back to your point, Mark, about sort of letting them in on the secret of how language learning works, but it's also, I think, if we can value moments, if we observe them in our class, when you can see that that students have been working together to create something new almost, or that they've been scaffolding each other. And
Collaborative.
I saw that
learning,
happening recently in a class I was teaching, where the two students were so totally into understanding what the other person was saying, and they were doing a really, really simple little task, but they were totally into it, and they were helping each other to get the right words out. And it wasn't that they both knew what that person wanted to say. It was all, they didn't need to be said, but they were happy to work through 3 or 4 different paraphrases until they kind of, that's what I wanted to say, and there was a little moment, and it was a little moment that I could just go like, yes, well done, made a note of it, and then we could come back to it afterwards, and it was just being able to celebrate those moments when the students are making a little breakthrough. And, and again, it's because the task was something that they were willing to invest in. So they were investing their time, their effort, their concentration. They were really focused for that short time on communication purely.
And I think as well, if you reach that situation where you've got a good level of collaboration, they're motivated to do the task, then as well what happens is I think learners begin to recognise that they can actually learn from each other. Like you said, they can help one another, because I think there's a general perception that you might think, well, what's the point in talking to somebody whose language is maybe not even as good as mine, and it's a waste of time. But actually no, people will have different strengths and weaknesses, and working together they can actually learn from each other, which drives the motor of pair work and helps them to to progress and kind of support each other, which is important.
Yeah, the other thing I think is classroom management techniques, so that vary the kinds of tasks, not just the tasks, but the way that the tasks are performed in class. And so you have your pair work and the students work in pair, collaborating or in group work, but then getting them to sort of raise the stakes a little bit and get them to do it in front of the whole class or something like that. And this puts them under a little bit more pressure, but that is kind of what the real operating conditions in which they will be in the outside world. And there's so many times I've spoken to students where they say, well, the speaking tasks are fine. It's a little bit like me with the coffee break thing, so I can do it in the coffee break. The same with the classic pair work stuff that we do. Yeah, it's good. The students are making noise. They're speaking. The teacher can more or less monitor, but to give them that sense of achievement, sometimes it's necessary to raise the stakes and to get them to do the same task, okay, but this time without their notes, or this time in front of everyone, things like that.
Sort of building their confidence.
Building up their confidence that way. I mean, obviously you're not going to do it
straight up,
sort of overnight or whatever, but that does give them an amazing sort of
if you're doing that often enough, then you normalise it. It's kind of the eternal human capacity to get used to things, and to if you're doing it, if that becomes an integral part of the lesson, and then it's normal to do that, then they get used to it, and they develop the.
There's a classic one of a teacher inviting somebody into. I mean, I don't know if you've all done that. I remember doing that a lot when I was teaching. Regularly, this idea, bring in a friend or bring in someone, and they just have to ask them 20 questions or whatever. When the students suddenly realise that this is a real person, and they have to, it's always very palpable that they suddenly, they need to get a lot.
Rise to the occasion.
They rise to the occasion. They need to get information from this person in a certain amount of time, and this person is a real person. There's not a sort of an invented one. And I think these things, we've all seen that sudden moments where the students come. All of us have had different anecdotes where we've seen that at the moment where a student or group of students somehow come to life. And it's all to do with the nature of the task, it's to do with classroom management, sometimes it's to do with allowing them space, time, allowing them to work together, many different aspects involved, but all of it contributes to students feeling safer and more confident speaking.
You know, when we were talking earlier about your personal experiences, so there was a judo club, the AGM, and the school parent-teacher association.
Yeah.
So presumably that happened a while ago. So has it changed? Do you now feel more comfortable?
Well, this actually happened to be like 2 weeks
Oh,
ago.
is it 2 weeks ago?
It happened to
So
me a
far-
few weeks ago as well, so
Did it
no,
really?
I still haven't fully recovered
you,
from the
so you
incident.
But what I was wondering was, you did have something that you were bursting to say
Yes,
at the AGM, but you didn't.
No, I didn't know.
So there's something more than competency and the need to say something that's going on. There's something else that must be preventing.
This is why the
us from
psychological
speaking out.
element of,
Yeah.
of speaking is so important, because I guess you can tell from listening to us that we're talking about fluency stages of lessons rather than just controlled practice, etc. So somehow, I don't know, as I say, the psychology or the feeling that the learners have is so hugely important. Like if you had been relaxed and you felt that you wouldn't be judged, and I'm sure they wouldn't have, to be honest, but
Oh, no, they
sometimes
wouldn't, but
we're
it
holding
was-
ourselves
I think we judge
We
ourselves.
judge
We're
yourself.
judging
Yes, and go
ourselves
for it.
more,
Yeah.
aren't we?
Yeah,
I
we
think
are.
that's-
We're the
yeah.
hardest
And
judges.
students do
Yeah.
as well,
Yeah.
because as I
Yeah.
say, fear of making mistakes, and even though you tell them sometimes, but this is the idea of you have such an engaging task that I actually forget about whether they're making mistakes or not, and you're not correcting them. So you're
No.
at a fluency stage, you don't correct, so you're just turning them loose on the language. And if they can get that involved in the task, then if you had got involved in your task,
If there was a
it would make it a
tangible,
lot
like
easier.
I mean, in a sense, this is a kind of an example of it, because actually, once you get over the barrier of speaking, you're okay. Like I'm sure we were all a little bit nervous before we started this, and we kind of sat down and put microphones on, and it's a little bit intimidating doing something like this, and you feel the nerves more before, but once you actually get into it, and like we're doing now, we're actually speaking, and once you get going,
Speak for yourself, I'm
it's more
petrified.
It's an immersive activity, that's the whole idea.
Certain students you have to help in different ways than others. I was
That's
thinking
true.
when I went to Mexico as a teenager, I think I was 19, and I had no problems making mistakes and asking questions, and I wanted to learn. And I had a friend that traveled with me, and she just learned to say lo mismo, which means the same thing. So she'd let me order the movie tickets, and she'd walk up and say lo mismo. And it's kind of finding that student that, how do you help that student?
Yeah.
And, maybe it's pairing people with different pairs versus groups and giving them different opportunities where they might feel safer speaking and finding a way to help everyone kind of
But-
be that bolder student that's willing to make a mistake and it doesn't matter.
And I think as well, part of it lies in actually seeing the results of what you're doing. So if you can get somebody, it's that situation, say if it was an individual lesson, for example, where somebody was a little bit frustrated about their ability to communicate in English and maybe not doing so well. And it's that kind of moment, which I guess a lot of teachers experience, is when you're listening to a student telling you something and you're genuinely interested in what they're saying, and the way you're looking at them and the way you're kind of responding is because you're interested in what they're actually telling you, and you're not listening to the language, you're really interested, and they can see that you're reacting in that way, and they're thinking to themselves, he's really interested in this, and I'm getting my message across, and I'm actually communicating successfully. It's working, yeah. So creating a situation where they can experience that satisfaction of actually, getting the message across is
I think that's when you
is a motivation.
when you create a task which has a tangible outcome which can be shared, sort of whatever it is that you're aiming towards, having something which you will then be able to present to the class and kind of be proud of, what our group came up with, I don't know, solving whatever problem, and that then each group is presenting theirs, and and they're actually interested in seeing what everybody else came up with, and sharing that, then you're kind of simulating there, aren't you, that you have an interested audience. So there's this, the idea of not only paying attention to the speaker, but that the listener is also important, so that it's important that we structure tasks in a way that the listeners are genuinely interested in what the other students are talking about. So you have like a captive audience. You have people who are willing you to say what you're going to say because they're really interested in hearing what it is. So it would be totally simulating your interest in your students.
And there's the reward at the end. They get the reward of it being, because that's the most basic truth of kind of psychology, isn't it? People do things that are rewarding, and And
very
if you're
satisfying.
and if you're kind of feeling rewarded that that was I got a
Yeah, and
message
then if
across
you-
and that the person was interested and I maybe even made them laugh or kind of entertain them a little bit, then that's rewarding. And
And if you can
That's the
build in
motivation
some
to
kind
speak.
of a peer feedback stage where then, they actually get some kind of affirmation from their classmates for their performance in that task, whether it's, how they did it or what they came up with, but that you actually have, okay, these people, they listen to me and now they're kind of responding to me, and it
And I
That's really
think that
important.
takes some of the pressure
Absolutely,
off
yeah.
and helps them feel more relaxed. Because if you're not engaged in what the other person is saying or don't have a reason to listen, then all you're thinking about is what am I going to say when it's my turn to speak? Whereas they are actually active in the listening, it takes a little bit of that anxiety away because they're not thinking about themselves and what's next. And
But that stage, that reporting back stage, and then their reflection on task stage, there's
Yeah.
a fundamental as a way of, as Kerry was saying, encouraging the role of the listener as well.
in fact, those reflecting on the task and feeding back on your peer moments
Yeah.
might be the times in the lesson when you're focused least on how you're saying things and
Yeah.
what you're actually saying. So if you're actually more interested in letting the person that you were listening to know that you listened to them and that you appreciated them and that your focus is all on the person that you're speaking to, suddenly you're not so important anymore. They're the person who's
Yeah.
important. And at that point, you have actually created a moment when the speaking isn't, you're not thinking about, oh, I'm not saying this quite right, or you're sort of,
You're talking about somebody else is speaking.
yeah,
Takes
it's kind of getting a bit meta, but yeah.
No, but I
And
think
it's
I think that's-
and it that also relates to error correction, because the flip side of that is we're talking about feeling rewarded and the positive side of communicating, but also if you're in an environment where you feel as though you're going to be criticised and corrected all the time,
that's very
then you kind of it's as if everything you say is going to be criticised and somebody's going to say something negative and there's correction. And so I think it's important to counteract that as well and have an environment where you can speak without being negatively judged all the
how
time.
would you manage that feedback, peer feedback, I think is what we were talking about earlier. How would you manage that?
Teacher.
But for it not to be judgmental, because it is kind of fundamentally.
You mean
kind of
from the
judging.
teacher?
No,
From
from
the
the
students.
from the
Students
student
themselves.
feeding back to a student after a task.
Yeah, so how would you...
When you
how could-
focus on whatever the
Okay.
mechanism of the task is
Yeah.
and whatever the shared outcome is, then the peers will have some way of feeding back on that, which would hopefully be some kind of listening task that the students have. Let's say there's a presentation and there are 3 points you have to look out for. So, I don't know, it would be you could have which was the most original story, which was the funniest story, which was the most serious story, which was the story that made you think. And so that basically that would be a very, very simple mechanism for it. But the listeners are listening to the story itself. They're going to comment on the contents of the story or their own personal response to that story, which is probably the richest kind of response you can give, is to give your personal response to the story that was told to you. So I think it's important that during the production that there is a task set for the listeners and that they know what it is that they're going to feed back on afterwards, but then that we do give time, plenty of time for that feedback to happen, so that you have and I think not only in that moment, but also setting up for future tasks. You have this idea of, oh wow, people are going to be listening to me. So I'm going to, up my game again. And exactly. It's going to, it becomes a cycle then.
I think what you mentioned about time is really important as well, because very often these speaking tasks at the end of a unit or the end of a class, and the teacher's running out of time. If we're talking about these kinds of extended speaking tasks or collaborative speaking tasks or immersive speaking tasks, where there's these different stages there, the teacher really does need to give the ample time for the preparation, obviously, for them to, to whatever, to make notes, to prepare, to brainstorm, whatever, but also for this whole feedback, reporting back stage as well. And that can take probably longer than maybe most teachers would devote to a speaking task, even an extended speaking task. So I think, again, that's maybe one of the problems that these speaking tasks are. Well, sometimes the speaking tasks are glorified language practice activities and they're not genuine speaking tasks, but that sometimes also happens. but the speaking tasks that are genuinely have a communicative aim, that they are given enough space and time for them to be exploited properly, and for all those stages that we've been talking about to
I think that sense of achievement, sometimes you need to have the whole class closure moment for everyone to feel like the task came to an end and we did it, you know, and then you can feel good about having completed it. Whereas sometimes, I think observing less experienced teachers, there'll be this like, this wonderful task, lots of energy going on, but right, end the class, off you go. And you go,
That's true.
That happens a lot.
What a shame, what a missed opportunity not to have been able to take what happened there and to be able to get the students to reflect on it, build on it.
Then you have to do it then. You can't. It's not something you can do the next
Too
time.
late,
You have to do it in that moment once the students have performed, and then you have to sort of have that reflection or the feedback moment and give that ample time.
There's also that temptation. It's like, you know, hey, this is going
We've
so
done the
well.
task,
I'm not going to rein it in so I can give feedback.
Actually, that's very timely because
We've run out of time.
No, we haven't run out of time.
Rein
But
us in.
just reining you in there.
I was just dying to make another point too.
I just wanted to make sure that we had time for any questions actually from the audience. So does anybody have any questions? And there might be some online as well. Have we got some? Should we ask Facebook first then? Ask Facebook, is that a thing? Not really.
Oh, is that allowed? Should we not be giving, you know, priority to the people in the
Maybe we should. Oh, okay, I will do that.
So before you made those suggestions about supportive peer feedback, there were some questions about how peers could support each other, not laugh at each other if they made mistakes. So I guess any more general points about that, about how
to manage,
how we can make sure that students are supportive of one another.
right?
Well, I think we could guide that feedback. You know, the feedback doesn't have to be how you could do better, but it could be maybe something like, what didn't you understand? Or what do you want to know more about? Or what did you like? You know, you could guide that feedback with questions at times so that they're framed in a very positive way.
So what do you want to know more is a nice one because it kind of extends if it was a discussion, it extends the discussion, or if it was an anecdote. And it's a very nice task for the peers is to think of one question you'd like to ask that person.
I also think that the teacher sets the tone for this kind of thing, that the way that the teacher behaves towards her or his students and the respect that they show and the true interest, not just a classroom interest, but will also set a model for the students among themselves, you know, that it's not laughed at or judged, but it is, you're just interested and encouraging.
Okay.
And working
let's
with...
go to the room. Oh, question. Cara?
No,
We
go on.
can hear. Maybe for the recording. Yeah.
Yes, I wanted to ask you what you saw the potential of digital technology in improving speaking skills.
So you're talking about virtual classrooms, or are you,
Any potential you see?
okay, I think I've got, I was going to say that's the other one, of course, is kind of recording any kind of speaking task so you've captured it and then you can revisit it, whether you do that in the classroom. I find it incredibly useful, especially with exam preparation classes, to get them to be aware of their own performance and so to listen to themselves. And something that we do quite a lot is maybe an initial task, record it, and then look at it and say, okay, now we want to complicate it, or, you know, this is how you've got this far, but now you need to add this much more to it, and they actually work with the recording, write their own transcripts, either for themselves or for another student, for a classmate. I think there's so much you can do with recordings. I guess Paul's probably going to want to... Does that answer your question?
Well, for noticing the gap, you mean, between the performance before and the...
Well, but also for building on it.
What about artificial intelligence and...
You mean like having a chat with Siri?
Yes, yes, exactly. Being able to use
or being able to get
a
the
more
elevator
advanced
to
form of
respond
Siri.
even if you're Scottish, that kind of thing.
Yes.
I'm kind of slightly out of my depth with that, really. I think the whole Siri thing, as far as I know at the moment, is still slightly problematic as far as voice recognition of accented speech. It can, I think, be quite frustrating, although I know that it's getting better and better all the time, and you can train the voice recognition to recognize your particular idiolect. And so there's obviously massive potential there.
So if it was available and we
Yeah.
were able to sort of, for example, be able to interact with something like Siri, do you think there would be demand from students to do that? Do you think that would be one way of overcoming
I would have thought, I would imagine that would be something that you would encourage students to do on their own,
Yeah.
you know? It's
Yeah,
kind
I
of like,
think
it's the kind of thing that
Yeah.
we play with, you know, when my kids tease me for my Spanish accent, my British accent in Spanish. And so they make me say things to Google or whatever in Spanish, and like it's hilarious because they never interpret my speech. But you know, so that's a great way for students to be playing with the language outside the classroom. And I would say that it had a massive potential for
Self-study.
self-access.
Yeah.
But within the classroom, I'm sure there's ways that we could play with it as well.
Self-access,
Yeah.
really.
Oh, yeah.
But I mean, I guess it would raise the question as well, to what extent you would actually engage with something that you knew was not a real person. If it was, you know, if it's more basic interaction, then I could see the value in it. But if it's more at a slightly higher level and you want to have a conversation and a kind of an exchange of ideas and exchange of views,
It could be very playful practice.
Yeah. I mean, I'm just raising it as a question. You know, to what extent would somebody be able to kind of
Go to that trouble, maybe.
engage with them?
It might give them confidence that they can be understood.
Yeah,
And the
Yes.
pronunciation,
So,
a lot of the pronunciation
yeah.
tools
But
available.
oftentimes they wanted to be able to handle real life situations that were unpredictable and unexpected, because when they got out in the real world, okay, they can talk about topics, but when they got out, they would suddenly, somebody needed help or something would happen, and you're not going to get that out of Siri, and they're not going to give you situations to react to. So I think they need real people.
Okay, thank
as
you.
well.
Talking of real people, I remember I saw
I
a
think Paul
session.
has a question.
Oh, okay,
Yeah.
sorry, Paul.
No, sorry, I just wanted to make
Yeah.
sure that Paul was getting the mic.
Hi, can I just sort of riff off that a little bit? I think one of the ways that AI and machine learning can definitely help is in terms of motivation, in terms of feedback, and in terms of scaffolding. And you know, very often what machines can do is look at the huge amount of data that's generated and then provide, you know, what's now being called as adaptive learning, where a student is kept at, you know, at the peak of their ability and they're always feeling challenged. And so I think that's really important for motivation, and providing that just-in-time feedback that, again, is really important for motivation and for learning. So rather than getting feedback at the end of a test after the end of a week or something, they're getting it immediately and based on the context in which they're you know, they're
And what would
interacting.
you say now, though? Like, you know, at what point are we at with AI and the ability to give feedback on speaking?
We're quite far from that, I think. at the
Yeah.
moment.
That was my feeling, but I know that you know more about this than I do.
But my question was totally unrelated. I mean, I think what everyone has done tonight is kind of reveal how complex it is to teach speaking. And we've talked about fear, anxiety. You've talked about feeling comfortable when you're sort of backstage, you know, in a different informal environment. We've talked about the psychology, the sociology of it. We've talked about group dynamics. All of these complex interweaving factors that can really make a difference. The role of the teacher, you know, the protection of self-identity. Bearing in mind that this is a very, very complicated set of components, you know, ingredients, what would you say the implications are for teacher training? Is this something that teachers can learn to manage all of these different factors, or is it something you just develop over time? What sort of insights could you
I think sometimes the best way for teacher training is for them to experience it. So if they're experiencing an engaging task where they're speaking and kind of understanding all these things that seem really complex, but then when they're asked to do something, you could immediately highlight several of those things, you know, the fear, the anxiety, and how your students might feel. Might be one way to go about it.
But as part of teacher training.
As a part of teacher
Yeah,
training,
okay.
to have the teacher's experience with the students.
I think it'd be quite interesting to, especially maybe with initial teacher training, to have teachers focus specifically on one pair or one group and give them some kind of observational task as to what's actually happening with that group. And initially, that they would simply be observing and making notes on whatever they found interesting. And then you could shape that for them. And then they could maybe give some feedback in the next class with those students on that particular task. I think there are ways that we can work with it, but I'm not sure we actually do as much as we could do. I think we probably could devote more time to the actually what's going on, how learning is happening during a speaking task, and not just how to manage a speaking task, which is also important. But then it's the so what? So we've done the speaking task, but so to know the value of it.
The responsive teaching or receptive, the idea, because we focus so much on classroom management techniques, what to do in this situation, but very often that's that sensitivity or the empathy or rapport, which is a little bit, as you say, a bit difficult to pin down exactly what it is. But we've all been in that, we've all seen when a successful task takes place and why it takes place, and perhaps just to pin down that a bit more, it could be useful.
And I think as well too, I mean, as we're saying, it's complex and it's kind of, it can be a bit touchy-feely, and but I think maybe trainee teachers, maybe their expectation is that it's all to do with techniques and there are kind of strategies, but actually a lot of trainee teachers might really have a good personality from they might be really good at making people feel relaxed and creating a good atmosphere, and so that they're aware not to underestimate the importance of those kind of innate skills that they've got that's actually not really to do with training. It's just kind of human interaction, and they might feel as though that's maybe not so important when actually it's hugely important, and to just kind of flag that up as we had a really good laugh earlier on when you were doing that technique and that sample lesson, and it was really relaxed, and don't underestimate the importance of doing that, and just the human side of it.
Should we take one more question from Facebook, Fran?
So we've got some questions from students wanting to, I'll group together a few together, wanting to know in a non-English speaking country how they can develop their own speaking. And related to that, a teacher asking what the characteristics of a student who will excel are. So what makes a student who's going to succeed in speaking?
I think role models. So suddenly, I don't know why it came to mind, the idea of get learners who on YouTube. I saw a talk about this the other day, and that's why it's on my mind. But I remember this particular teacher talking about YouTube videos of celebrities, or maybe footballers or something, talking, and then you don't expect they're just footballers, but then you see them in the past, and then how they've progressed in press conferences and things like that. And these kind of, I like to think of them sort of like sympathetic role models, where the students see someone who's famous, but they don't see them, never have seen them in the role of as a language learner. And that can be quite motivating. It's just the idea of the internet is full of these role models, possible role models, or unexpected role models that could be useful for learners to look at, to see people in a different light to how they're normally seen.
I would say as well, just to, really simply, just to find somebody else that you can speak to in English. They don't have to be at a higher level than you. They don't have to be a kind of a teacher. If you can find somebody who also wants to learn English, who's at a similar level, and you could just practice speaking to each other. There's a very high level of value. I think there's a lot of people who don't realise how beneficial that is. Just practicing speaking and actually just doing it.
You can, at a very, very basic level, speak to yourself. You might be taken for a complete mad person.
I'm a high level and I speak to myself quite often.
Okay. But it is actually something that, we do anyway in L1, is if we're going to go into some kind of situation where we think it's a little bit awkward, I'm not quite sure what I'm going to say, and we just rehearse that in our mind anyway, don't we? So you can do that if you want in the L2. You can decide, I'm going to talk to myself at a very basic level. You can set your phone in the language that you're learning. You can set your computer to speak to you in the language that you're learning. You can look for communities online. There are Skype language-based communities where you can find a language exchange, so you don't have to live somewhere where there is the potential of a language exchange right on your doorstep. You know, I live in a university town in the south of Spain, so at this time of year there's like enormous amount of people just dying to do a language exchange. So my students, they don't look for it though, you know, it's there. Not all of them will go out and grab that opportunity, and so sometimes you kind of need to just make them more aware of the things that they can do. And those students who are going to excel are the students who've already found those opportunities for themselves. The students who go up to the cruise ship passengers and insist on giving them directions to somewhere they don't even want to go to, you know, sort of, but they're the ones who actually are proactive.
And I think willing to make mistakes, that are willing to just speak and...
Yeah. And who are doing as many different things as they can with the language and just looking for and are really genuinely interested and finding things that interest them in the language. I think that's kind of they are going to be the ones who will excel. So what do we do for the ones who aren't? Then we have to try and help them kind of ignite that interest, or give them a positive experience with something so that they think, oh man, you know, that worked, I'll do it again. And there's this whole idea of how can you actually get them addicted to the success of doing something in English.
For nervous students, I think I heard from a friend of mine a very successful technique used by her sister, who is a stunning speaker of German. And basically she went through and she said everything in the book. She would go over and over it again. She said every time she passed her sister's room, she could hear this German voice going on and on, and she was doing the dialogues both sides. But and just practice, she got so fluent and her pronunciation improved, and she would listen and tape it again. But the point was to get the words out of your mouth and just get that fluency going. And after a while of doing that, she went to Germany after a very, very short time, and they thought she was German.
Wow.
She practiced it so much. But it's that idea of, I need to get the words out of my mouth. I've got nobody else to do it with, so at least get it out. And don't be, at first you feel really embarrassed. But they said, talk loudly and really get it out.
Talk loudly.
No, just go for it
Shout.
big time. And it really works.
I think
it's a very
like,
good technique.
Like you were saying, Mark, was find someone else to speak the language with,
absolutely.
even if they, you know, they're not a competent speaker in that language. Just play with it. You know, so I'm thinking about my teenage son who had to start studying French, and it was like a had to, because it suddenly became compulsory. And he'd missed 3 years of French. He was kind of thrown in the deep end. But we spent the summer talking nonsense French to each other in the sea when we were down on the beach. We'd have these silly conversations in French. But actually it was great fun, you know, sort of, it was kind of, and you know, that playfulness again for some students is a real key to them overcoming all of the psychological
and that's how you discover language as well, because these days it's so easy to translate words and look them up very quickly, so that if you decide to have a conversation about something that interests you, then you stumble on words that you don't know, and you can just say, just wait a minute, I'll look that up, and it's kind of you discover language by doing that.
I've just realised we've got literally 56 seconds left, so you've each got about 5 seconds. My maths is terrible. 10 seconds. 10 seconds.
Your maths is truly terrible, Caroline.
It's going down all the time.
Yeah.
A top tip. So for teachers out there struggling teaching speaking, what would be your top tip for them? Who's going first? Ben.
Well, I'm going back to my coffee break anecdote. I think what I learned from that, and what maybe the teacher learned as well, was make classes conversation driven. So, you know, chat to your learners from the teacher's point of view. And, you know, there is such a thing as a dialogic pedagogy, you know, this idea of learning through conversation and not always having to I mean, we've spoken a lot about we've spoken a lot about the benefits of
little but often.
Conversation-driven classes. Sorry.
That's okay.
Catherine?
I would say as often as you can, make speaking activities felt and not forced. And if the students feel like talking, they're going to speak. And if they feel like they're forced to talk, they may speak, but it's not going to be as natural. The anxiety is going to come.
Leslie?
I was going to just say enjoy it, but I was also thinking that we hadn't mentioned that students feel very nervous about speaking and being observed by others, so that if they're always working in pairs and groups, and there are lots of voices going on around that they don't feel so self-conscious. So I think that's one of the hugest values of pair and group work. They're surrounded by voices, it's normalised, but they don't feel embarrassed and focused on.
Mark?
I'd create a really good atmosphere, a really relaxed, friendly atmosphere, and as part of that, explain things to students at the beginning. You know, don't worry about making mistakes. You learn by doing that. It's not, you're not going to be judged, and atmosphere.
Okay, fantastic. Okay, thank you very much. Just for everyone here and online, we're going to keep going with this conversation on our social media channels. Fran, what did you want to say?
I just want to encourage everybody to have a look at the chat online, because there's some really great suggestions there too.
Great, okay. Will that keep going? Will that chat keep going after this session? How do we?
Once the live sessions, but the recording will be available.
Okay. So we can pick up on some of those conversations on our other channels. Okay. Thank you everybody so much for being here. Thank you very much for our panel.
Thank you, Caroline.
Really
Thank you for coming.
And good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.